Finally, video 10. I hope you watched 9.5, the bonus video about layers and working planes. It's not essential for this next step, but it will make working in 3D less frustrating if you understand those concepts. Either way, we have our 3D door ready for our viewports. A few videos back, we used old school methods to draw the door in a front and a section view by hand. And for something simple like a single door flat or a detail or a prop drawing or something, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're designing a whole building or a scenic design or any kind of large project, sheet layers and viewports become essential. Remember, we have two layers already. The 3D view of our door, that's the name we gave it, 3D view, that's where we extruded the rectangles into our 3D model. And we have the original 2D drawing of the flat that I renamed ortho view. We also have three classes: none, where almost everything we have drawn still is, and dimensions, and the class that we made, labels. We don't need that label class in our viewport, so go ahead and click on the middle column to the left of the name and hide that label class. Let's create a sheet layer for our viewport drawings. Move into front view and make sure that you are on the 3D layer. Find the view menu and select Create Viewport from the list. Viewports need to live on sheet layers, which I'll explain more about in a second. But since we don't have any sheet layers in our document, the first thing that will happen is that Vectorworks will create sheet layer 1 for our viewport to appear on. In earlier versions, you would need to tell Vectorworks which layers and classes you wanted drawn, but current versions inherit the scale, the view, and even the render settings that you have in the design layer where you create the viewport. You can always open these menus and add or remove layers or classes or change the scale or any other settings, but we can also do all that once the viewport and the sheet layer is created. So click OK, and a pop-up will appear asking us to name our auto-generated sheet layer. You can leave layer sheet 1 alone, but change the name to door elevation. And now we've been teleported to the new sheet layer. Notice up in the view bar that it now reads sheet 1 door elevation, or an abbreviation of that. And we have a viewport of our door in the same view, scale, and render settings that we had in the design layer. So what is a sheet layer in a viewport? Notice the workspace looks a little different. We see the page edge and the printable area automatically. The other important thing to remember is that a sheet layer is always in full scale. This is the piece of paper that's going to come out of the printer. Remember that when we made the title block on the design layer, we needed to make it 4 foot 6 inches long or whatever. That's because we were drawing on the design layer whose scale was set to 1 inch to the foot. But now, if we start drawing on the sheet layer, the title block is in real-world scale dimensions. It's just the size it will be when it's ink on paper. So how do we have scale drawings then? Well, that's what viewports are. A viewport is kind of like a display panel or a monitor linked to a camera back on the design layer. If we make any changes in the design layer, then all we need to do is update the viewport, and any views that show that change will be redrawn and changed everywhere. Notice the red and orange stripe border around the viewport, or red and white if it's deselected. That's an indication that the viewport has not been updated. In some cases, you might want to leave a viewport unupdated. Maybe you want to show two options of an object. You could create two viewports and then make a change to the 3D model and only update one viewport. But in most cases, you're going to want to hit the update button up here in the object info, or you can right click on the edge of the viewport and update from there, or you can go back up to the view menu and select update selected viewports or update all viewports. But beware, update all will update all the viewports in the entire file, even on other sheet layers. So sometimes that can take longer than you expect. Once we have one viewport on the sheet layer, we can make other views from the first. We can always go back to the design layer and create another viewport from scratch, but we can just copy and paste another existing viewport. I'm going to select the viewport with the X selection tool and hold down Control, and I'm just going to drag out another copy. But you can also Control or Command C and V to copy and paste if you want. With a copy selected, let's look at the object info. We can name this drawing here and change its drawing number if we want. We can add or remove layers and classes here again. For example, say the door flat was on one class and the door itself was on another. Perhaps we would want a drawing without the door shown. We could simply hide that class for this particular viewport while keeping it visible everywhere else. Also, viewports will only show layers and classes that existed when the viewport was created. So if later on we decided to create a new class and move the door to that new class in the design layer, then when we came back to the viewports, and when we updated them, the door would disappear. We'd need to go back in here and turn on the new class that wasn't there when the viewport was created. Moving on, we can change the scale. Each viewport will inherit the scale of the design layer it was created on, but you can change that at any time here. And you can have as many viewports as you want on a sheet layer, and all of them can have different scales. Let's skip over these and find View. It should be set to Front, but open the drop-down and select Right Isometric from the list. And notice that we're now looking at the door from a right isometric view. And that would be a headache to draw by hand with our old-school 2D method. It may have switched the rendering style to wireframe. If so, let's change that with the next menu, Background Render. So you can set it to shaded or wireframe or whatever you want. If you have it, if it switched it to wireframe, then go ahead and select shaded. If it's already shaded, then you're good. And you can see that it looks just like our drawing back on the design layer. There's some important stuff under the Background Render Settings button. We have a bunch of options for what is drawn. The Textures button is checked, meaning that if we had applied textures like wood or stucco or brick or whatever back on the design layer model, we could choose to have them rendered in the viewport. And sometimes you want that, but normally for drafting, you don't. And since we didn't apply any textures, this check won't make any change. Color is the attribute color we applied back on the design layer. Remember, we set all of the fill to a light gray. That's why there's a light gray fill on all the objects here. Anti-aliasing smooths out diagonal lines and helps us get rid of that stair-step look, and I don't know why you would ever want that turned off. You can check shadows if you have light objects in your design layer and you want them to cast shadows on the surfaces. We don't have any lights on our design layer, so like textures, this check won't do anything right now. The one that I want you to pay attention to is this one, Draw Edges. It's on now, it's on by default, even though we need to update the viewport to see them. I'll close this dialog box for a moment and update the viewport. And notice that Vectorworks has outlined all the hard edges of our flat in black. Now, for this ISO view, maybe that's okay, but it's very important to know that draw edges are not vector lines. They're just pixels like a JPEG image. For a reference image like this, or an ISO view that's just on the drawing to help the reader visualize the 3D object, then maybe draw edges is fine. But for drafting, this is not the best way to go, as the lines can get very blurry and low resolution. So let me show you the viewport render settings that I strongly recommend. I'll click again on the background render settings and turn off textures and draw edges. And that keeps the shaded view, but it turns off the pixel lines. So now find the foreground render menu, and from that drop list, select hidden line. Update the viewport, and we get the best of both worlds. We still have the background shading that makes it very easy for us to read the 3D shape, but we get these razor sharp and scalable vector lines superimposed. These lines are scalable and snappable, just like regular drafting lines. Let's set this ISO view scale to 3/4 of an inch to the foot, just so that you can see that you can have multiple viewports on the same sheet layer with multiple scales. Now let's make a section view of our door flat with a few clicks. Select the first viewport of the front view. With the viewport selected, this won't work if there's no selected viewport, go back to the View menu and select Create Section Viewport. Now we need to show Vectorworks where and in which direction we want the section to be drawn from. I'm putting my cursor just above the center of the door and clicking once. And now I'm going to move my cursor straight down. You can hold the Shift key if you want to lock it in. And then I'm going to click a little bit below the door, and then I'll move the cursor to the left a bit to show that we want to draw it in that direction toward the doorknob. And I'm going to double click to tell it that I'm happy. And we get another pop-up. We can change whatever we want here, but for now, let's just enter a drawing name and call it, all caps, Section View, and then OK. Check it out, Instant Section View. Back in the hand drafting days, I would devote a full working day to drawing a centerline section of a venue and a set design, and now it only takes about 5 minutes to make a centerline section plate. So I'm going to touch the corner of the flat, and I'm going to drag it until it snaps to the corner of the flat in the other viewport. And then I'm going to click, and then I'll hold a Shift key down as I drag the section view to the right, knowing that I'm keeping it perfectly aligned to the bottom of the flat in the other viewport. So you can snap to and align to other objects in other viewports. You can change how the section cut fill is drawn, but I'm not going to cover that here. There you go. Because we had the 3D model of our flat, we were able to generate 3 views in a few seconds. And you already know how to add dimensions and notes. It's the same process that you've already done in 2D, but we'll need to use the annotation view of the viewports. We'll talk about how to edit the viewports and annotate them in the next video.